Okay, so I want you to imagine something. Imagine I just handed you a resume.
Okay.
It's just a single sheet of paper, standard formatting.
Mm-hmm.
You scan down to the experience section, and here's what you see. First line, world-class concert organist.
Right. Impressive start.
Immediately under that, revolutionary theologian. Then PhD in philosophy. And for the final line, jungle doctor.
I'd assume you accidentally stapled 4 different LinkedIn profiles together.
Exactly. It reads like a glitch in the simulation.
Yeah, there's no way.
It sounds like the resume of 4 different, very ambitious people, not one. It just feels, I don't know, genuinely impossible by modern standards.
Well, it does because we live in the age of hyper-specialization, right?
It's a lane.
Pick a lane and stay in it. The modern world tells you if you're a doctor, you're a doctor. If you're a musician, you're a musician. You don't get to be a world authority in both. It's just not done.
But today, we're doing a deep dive into the life of a man who didn't just switch lanes. It feels like he built entirely new highways in completely contradictory territories.
A very good way to put it.
We are talking about Albert Schweitzer.
Yeah.
And looking at the stack of sources we have here, I mean, we've got biographies, some very heavy theological texts, musical critiques, medical journals. Our mission today is to try and unpack how on earth one person achieve that level of mastery in all these fields.
And maybe more importantly, to explore the very complex, sometimes very controversial legacy of his philosophy. Because Schweitzer isn't just a quirky historical footnote. He was a superstar of the 20th century, a household name. And he fundamentally challenged how we think about civilization itself.
Exactly. We're going to look at the theology that absolutely shocked the church, the music theory that changed how we hear Bach, and, of course, the decision that made him famous, leaving all of that behind to go work in a chicken coop in Africa.
Yeah, chicken coop.
But before we get to the jungle, we have to start with the origin story. I mean, where does a polymath like this actually come from?
The geography is actually, I think, the first big clue to his psychology. Schweitzer was born in 1875 in Alsace. Now, for anyone who knows their European history, Alsace is a fascinating place. It's a border region that has basically been the ping-pong ball of Europe.
Bouncing between France and Germany.
For centuries. So depending on the year, your passport color changes.
Right.
Exactly. When Schweitzer was born, Alsace had just recently been annexed by the German Empire after the Franco-Prussian War. But culturally, the roots were still very, very French.
And then later it flipped back.
It did. After World War I, he became a French citizen. So from day one, he grew up fully bilingual, straddling 2 major European superpowers. He didn't see borders as these rigid, impassable walls. For him, they were fluid.
And that fluidity, that applied to his religious upbringing too, right? I found this detail about his childhood church in the village of Gunsbach. Absolutely wild.
It is a rare detail. It's so important. His father was the local Lutheran pastor, but the village church was something called a simultaneum.
A simultaneum.
Yeah, it's a fancy term meaning the church building was shared. The Protestants and the Catholics used the exact same sanctuary.
What? In the same building?
In the same building.
Wow.
They just had their services at different times in different parts of the church. The Catholics used the chancel. The Protestants used the nave.
That blows my mind for the late 19th century. Usually in that era, Protestants and Catholics weren't exactly borrowing each other's sugar, let alone sharing an altar space.
Not at all. It was incredibly rare. And growing up in that specific environment gave Schweitzer this foundational belief that dogma shouldn't divide us. He saw from childhood that true Christianity, and you could say true humanity, really should work toward unity.
Yeah, I guess if you can share a church building with people you supposedly disagree with on fundamental theology, maybe you can bridge other divides too.
That's the core of it. So he's got this open-minded, cross-cultural foundation. He goes off to university, and by his 20s, he is just on an absolute tear.
An academic explosion.
It really was. I mean, most people struggle to finish 1 degree. Schweitzer is collecting them like he's trying to complete a set. He gets a doctorate in philosophy and a licentiate in theology.
And this brings us to the first major pillar of his legacy, right? The theological revolutionary.
Yes. We have to understand that before he ever put on a stethoscope, Schweitzer dropped what was essentially a nuclear bomb on the academic world of theology.
You're talking about his 1906 book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. Now, to a modern ear, that title sounds a bit dry.
A little academic, yeah.
Maybe something you'd see on a dusty shelf in a seminary basement.
Yeah.
But you're saying this was a scandalous book?
Oh, scandalous is the right word. It is an absolute demolition job of the status quo. To understand why, you have to look at what the scholars were saying at the turn of the 20th century. The dominant view was what they called liberal Protestantism.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
What did the liberals believe about Jesus?
They essentially viewed Jesus as a great moral teacher, a kind of enlightened philosopher. They stripped away all the uncomfortable bits, the miracles, the mysticism, the scary judgment stuff. They painted a portrait of a kind, gentle figure who taught timeless ethical truths. Truths that, coincidentally, fit very nicely with modern, polite European society.
So they basically created a Jesus who looked a lot like a 19th century gentleman, a guy you'd be comfortable having over for tea.
Exactly. A respectable Victorian. They were projecting their own values onto him. And Schweitzer looked at the text. He really, really looked at the source material and said, no, you are making him in your own image. You are looking down a long, dark well and seeing your own reflection at the bottom.
Wow, that is a savage critique. So what did Schweitzer see in the well that they missed?
He argued that the historical Jesus was, in fact, an apocalyptic prophet.
Apocalyptic, like end of the world stuff.
Exactly. Schweitzer believed that Jesus thought the end of the world was imminent, not in some metaphorical sense, but literally.
For real?
He believed the kingdom of God was going to crash into history within the lifetime of his disciples. The whole mission was urgent because time was running out.
Wait, so Schweitzer, a Christian theologian, a guy training to be a pastor, is arguing that Jesus believed the world was about to end. And he was wrong.
That is the crux of the shock. That's the bomb. Schweitzer pointed to verses in Matthew and Mark like, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place, and said Jesus was operating under a consistent eschatology.
Eschatology. That's the study of the end times.
Right, the study of the last things.
Right.
And Schweitzer's argument was that Jesus wasn't just predicting the end, he was trying to force it to happen. He threw himself onto the wheel of history, as Schweitzer put it, to make it turn that final revolution. He went to the cross to trigger the apocalypse.
And it didn't happen.
It didn't happen. The world kept spinning. So the early church had to scramble to reinterpret everything. The whole idea of the kingdom of God had to be transformed from an imminent event into a future hope or an internal spiritual reality.
That is a staggeringly bold take for a guy who is supposed to be training pastors.
It is.
He's basically saying the foundation of the faith is based on a mistaken timeline.
It shattered the academic landscape. Conservatives were horrified. Liberals were furious because he took away their gentle teacher. But, and this is the key insight for our deep dive, Schweitzer didn't do this to destroy faith. He did it to strip away the comfortable illusions we'd built up.
To get back to the source.
To get back to the raw power of this figure, even if that figure was a stranger to our modern sensibilities.
There's that famous quote at the end of the book. It's really haunting. I think I have it here in the notes. He describes Jesus coming to us as one unknown.
Oh, yeah. That ending is one of the most powerful passages in 20th century theology. Read the full excerpt. It really captures his vibe.
Okay, here it is. He comes to us as one unknown, without a name, as of old, by the lakeside. He came to those men who knew him not. He speaks to us the same word, follow thou me, and sets us to the tasks which he has to fulfill for our time.
You see what he's doing there? He's saying you don't find Jesus by sitting in a library analyzing history books. You don't find him in dogma. You find him by obeying that command to serve. You discover who he is in the toils, the conflicts, the sufferings.
It shifts the entire focus from intellectual assent to active participation.
It's a theology of action. It's not about believing the right list of facts. It's about doing the work. And that just becomes the theme of his entire life.
Wow.
And he wasn't done. He applied that same rigorous, stripping-down approach to St. Paul, too. In his other big book, The Mysticism of Paul the Apostle, he challenged the Lutheran standard again.
And the Lutheran standard is usually all about justification by faith, right? That's the big one. The legal standing of the believer before God.
Correct. It's a courtroom metaphor. You are guilty, but Christ's righteousness is applied to you, so you're declared innocent. Schweitzer looked at Paul's writings and said, no, that's part of it, but you're missing the core. He argued the central concept for Paul was being in Christ.
Being in Christ.
A mystical union. It's not just a legal status change. It's a physical and spiritual participation in the dying and rising of Christ. It's about being incorporated into this new reality.
Participation. That seems to be the word of the day for Schweitzer. He can't just study a thing from a distance. He has to merge with it.
Which is the perfect transition to his other life.
His other full-time job.
Yes, because while he's dismantling 2,000 years of theology and reconstructing the New Testament, he's, just casually becoming one of the world's leading experts on Johann Sebastian Bach.
Casually. Doing something that would be a lifetime achievement for anyone else.
Yeah.
It really is like he had more hours in the day than the rest of us.
It certainly seems that way. And look, at the time, Bach was respected, of course, but he was often played in a very stiff, mathematical way.
Like a technical exercise.
Exactly. People treated his music like complex algebra. Technically impressive, but dry. Academic. Schweitzer comes along and tells his teacher, the very famous French organist Charles-Marie Widor, that they're all hearing it wrong. He says Bach is actually a painter.
A painter? How does that work in music? Is he talking about synesthesia or something?
In a way, yes. Schweitzer argued that Bach's melodies were pictorial. They weren't just abstract notes. They were illustrating the text of the hymns they were based on. He called Bach a musician-poet.
So, give me an example.
Okay, so if the lyrics of the chorale mentioned falling or sin or descent into the grave, the notes in Bach's organ part would literally tumble down the scale. If the text was about joy or resurrection or ascending to heaven, the rhythm would dance and the melody would climb upwards.
That completely changes the listening experience. It stops being abstract math and becomes a narrative, a story in sound.
It brings the emotion back. It connects the sound to the meaning. For Schweitzer, you couldn't separate Bach's music from his Lutheran faith. The music was theology. And he wasn't just analyzing the sheet music. He became obsessed with the mechanics of the instrument itself.
Right. He launched the Orgelbegon, the organ reform movement.
He did.
That sounds like a very serious political party. Vote for the organ reform movement. What was he actually reforming?
He absolutely hated the modern organs being built in the early 20th century. He saw them as these industrial factories. They were built for sheer volume, harsh, loud, high-pressure wind systems. They were designed to fill massive halls with just a wall of sound. Schweitzer wanted to save the old Baroque principles.
So he's a vintage gear snob. He's the guy saying, vinyl sounds better than digital.
In the best way possible, yes, a total purist. He wanted organs where the different voices were distinct. In a fugue, you have multiple melody lines weaving together. That's called polyphony.
Right.
On a loud, modern organ, that just turns into a wall of mud. You can't distinguish the lines. On a good Baroque organ, you can hear every single thread. He wanted clarity over raw power.
Speaking of clarity, I found a little technical nugget in the sources that I think the audiophiles listening will love. There is actually a Schweitzer technique for recording, isn't there?
Yes. This shows how deep his obsession went. Schweitzer, working with his engineers for his Columbia Records recordings, developed a specific microphone placement to capture that distinct spiritual sound he loved.
What did they do?
Instead of the standard setup, they used two small diaphragm condenser microphones, and they pointed them directly away from each other.
Pointed away. That seems totally counterintuitive. Usually you point the mic at the thing you want to record.
It does, but what it does is it captures the reflected sound of the room, the bloom of the notes mixing in the air of the church, rather than the direct, harsh attack of the sound coming straight from the pipes. It creates this specific stereo field that feels warm and spacious and alive.
He was a perfectionist.
Incredibly picky. He would listen back to the recordings and reject takes if he felt the instrument sounded too harsh or too direct. He was chasing a feeling, not just a perfect note.
Okay, so let's recap the scoreboard here, because this is where the story pivots so hard it gives you whiplash.
There it comes.
We have a guy who is a celebrity in theology. His books are required reading. He's a celebrity in music. He's a concert organist touring Europe. He is friends with the Wagner family at Bayreuth. He has a brilliant, comfortable academic career laid out in front of him. He's 30 years old. He has won the game of life.
And then the great pivot.
He drops the mic.
He literally blows up his own life. In 1905, he sends letters to his family and friends announcing that he is quitting everything. He is resigning his post as principal of the theological college. He is going to medical school to become a general practitioner, and then he is going to Africa.
Why? I mean, seriously, why? He has it made. Why would you do that?
It goes right back to that one unknown quote from his Jesus book.
A theology of action.
Exactly. He felt that he had been preaching words, but not living them. He wrote about feeling this deep sense of debt. He realized that he enjoyed all these privileges, art, science, religion, while most of the world was suffering in ways he couldn't imagine. He wanted to strip away all the intellectual arguments and follow the example of Jesus through direct practical service. He wanted to live his argument.
And I assume his friends and family were just thrilled about this noble sacrifice.
Oh, they were horrified, utterly horrified. They thought he was having a mental breakdown. Yes. They told him he was burying his talent in the ground. One friend basically wrote to him saying, "You are a general. Don't go fight in the trenches as a private." A man of his intellect, his genius, going to start over as a freshman medical student, it seemed insane. A waste.
And it wasn't just his friends, right? The actual missionary society, the people he wanted to work for, they didn't even want him.
That is the ultimate irony, isn't it? The Paris Missionary Society was deeply suspicious of him.
Because of his theology.
Of course. Remember, he's the guy who wrote the book saying Jesus was mistaken about the end of the world. They essentially said, we don't want you confusing the people with your radical liberal theology. We want simple gospel truth.
That is incredible. He wants to give up his entire life to serve, and they're checking his doctrine at the door.
Schweitzer had to meet with the board, and he had to specifically promise that he would go as a doctor, not as a preacher. He famously told them he would be mute as a carp regarding theology.
He had to promise not to talk about God so he could go serve God. That is a level of humility that's just hard to wrap your head around.
So he spends the next 7 years getting his medical degree. And by the way, he couldn't help himself. While he was doing that, he wrote a thesis for his MD defending Jesus's mental health against some psychiatric critics of the day who claimed Jesus was paranoid or had delusions.
Of course he did. He just squeezed that in between anatomy exams.
Yeah.
Because why not?
Finally, in 1913, he's ready. He leaves. He heads for Lambaréné in what was then French Equatorial Africa, now Gabon, and he doesn't go alone. His wife, Helene Breslau, is a vital part of this story. She was a scholar herself, but she trained as an anesthetist specifically to go with him and help.
And we have to talk about their luggage.
Yeah.
Because you don't just pack a carry-on when you're Albert Schweitzer moving to the jungle.
No, you do not. You pack a massive zinc-lined tropical-proof case containing a pedal piano.
A pedal piano. Explain that visual for us. What is that?
It's an upright piano that has a pedal board underneath it, exactly like a church organ, so he could practice his footwork for the Bach fugues.
So you have to imagine this scene.
It's cinematic.
A dugout canoe paddling up the Ogooué River into the dense, humid rainforest, avoiding hippos and crocodiles, carrying a future Nobel Prize winner, his wife, and a massive piano so he can play Bach in the jungle every evening.
It is the most perfect, absurd, and beautiful image. It captures his whole life. But once they get there, that movie turns into a gritty survival drama pretty fast.
Yeah, I imagine so.
I think people imagine he walked into some gleaming, pre-built facility. There was no hospital, nothing. They started treating patients in an abandoned chicken coop, literally.
A chicken coop. That is the definition of humble beginnings.
The conditions were just overwhelming. In the first 9 months alone, they treated 2,000 patients. We're talking malaria, leprosy, sleeping sickness, which is a horrible neurological disease, elephantiasis.
And he wasn't just battling germs. He was battling a completely different worldview.
Yes, completely. He wrote about treating patients with a profound fear of cannibalism from neighboring tribes, or patients who believed their illness was caused by a curse from a family member. He was a doctor, but also a sort of cultural negotiator.
And then, just as they're getting their footing, history intervenes again. World War I breaks out in 1914.
And here is the irony of his birthplace in Alsace coming back to bite him. He is a German citizen living and working in a French colony.
Oh, no.
Suddenly, the Grand Doctor is an enemy alien.
So the French military arrests the only doctor in the entire region.
Initially, they just put him under house arrest. So he kept working, but with a French soldier guarding him. But eventually, in 1917, he and Helene were taken back to Europe as prisoners of war.
You're kidding.
No. He spent time in internment camps in France. He didn't get back to Africa until 1924, years later.
That must have been absolutely devastating to build this thing from nothing, from a chicken coop, and then be dragged away because of European politics he had nothing to do with.
It was, but he was Schweitzer. He used that time in captivity to think and write. It's actually where he developed his most famous philosophical idea. And when he finally returns to Lambaréné in the 20s, he rebuilds the hospital, bigger this time. And this is where we have to get into the complexity of his legacy.
Okay.
Because for decades, Schweitzer was seen as a living saint. He was the grand doctor. But later, in the 50s and 60s, people started visiting and looking closer at the hospital and saying, wait a minute.
Right. This is a critical part of the deep dive. We can't just do the hagiography. What was the criticism? What were they seeing?
Visitors like the British journalist James Cameron and later the famous Nigerian author Chinua Achebe pointed out that the hospital was, well, the word they used was squalid.
Squalid.
Yeah, it lacked modern amenities. It wasn't the sterile, white-tiled environment you'd expect from a Western doctor. Animals roamed the grounds. It was chaotic and, to Western eyes, dirty. Achebe was particularly harsh about the hygiene standards he observed.
So was Schweitzer just a bad manager? Or was he intentionally keeping it primitive for some reason?
That is the heart of the debate. His defenders, like the American surgeon Edgar Berman, who volunteered there for years, argued that the squalor was a deliberate psychological choice.
What does that mean?
Schweitzer believed that if you built a terrifyingly sterile, modern Western hospital with white walls and intimidating beeping machines, the local villagers wouldn't come. They would be too frightened of the place.
So he wanted it to feel like their village, not like an alien environment.
Exactly. In Schweitzer's hospital, the patients' families lived with them on the grounds. They cooked for them over open fires. It was a functioning village that just happened to offer medical care in the middle. Berman claimed the survival rates for surgeries rivaled Western hospitals, even without the modern aesthetics.
So it was a feature, not a bug. But it definitely fueled the criticism that Schweitzer was stuck in the past, that he was paternalistic.
It did. And that brings us to the philosophy that underpinned all of this. Because while he's treating patients and fighting off driver ants and rebuilding his hospital, he's thinking. And he has this moment on the river that becomes his global slogan.
Reverence for life. In German, Ehrfurcht vor dem Leben.
That's it. And he considered this his greatest contribution. More than the music, more than the theology, more than the medicine, this was his big idea.
Unpack this for us, because reverence for life sounds like a nice bumper sticker, but I have a feeling he meant something much more rigorous.
Oh, much more. He felt that Western civilization was decaying, that it was on a path to self-destruction because it had lost its ethical foundation. We were too obsessed with technological progress and power, and not enough with basic ethics.
Okay.
His revelation, which he said came to him on the Ogooué River, was simple but radical. I am life which wills to live, and I exist in the midst of life which wills to live.
I am life which wills to live. It's not just that I have a life, but that I am life. It creates a solidarity between you and every other living thing.
Correct. And that's not a coincidence. This is where he was heavily influenced by Indian thought. Yes, specifically Jainism and the principle of ahimsa, or nonviolence to all living things. He read and translated couplets from the Tirukkural, an ancient Tamil text, and he called it lofty wisdom. The core idea is that ethics isn't just about how you treat other humans, it's about how you treat everything that is alive.
So how far does that go? Does that mean he wouldn't kill a mosquito?
He tried not to. There are stories of him stopping construction work to carefully move an ant colony out of the way. He would gently scoop insects out of puddles.
But he's a doctor. His whole job is killing bacteria and parasites all day long. How do you possibly reconcile reverence for life with treating malaria?
And that was the tragedy he wrestled with his whole life. He acknowledged that existence is built on one life, preying on another. It's a constant, horrible conflict. But he argued that a thinking, ethical human should never accept that complacently.
You have to feel the weight of it.
Yes. You only kill when it is absolutely necessary for the survival of a higher form of life, and you do it with a sense of guilt and responsibility. You never kill for sport, for fun, or thoughtlessly.
So it's about mindfulness. It's about recognizing the cosmic weight of taking a life, even if it's a small one.
Exactly. And this philosophy, this deep respect for all life, makes the next part of our discussion even more complicated and uncomfortable. We have to address the elephant in the room regarding race.
Yeah. There is a specific quote that always comes up in any critique of Schweitzer. He famously said, "The African is indeed my brother, but my junior brother."
It's a painful quote to read today, and we have to be honest about it. It reflects a deeply paternalistic worldview.
It's awful.
It is. Schweitzer believed in the inherent dignity of every person, and he literally dedicated his life to serving Africans, but he did not view them as social or political equals in the modern sense.
Junior brother. It implies they need guidance, supervision, that father knows best.
Yes. He thought Gabonese independence, when it came too early. He operated with a very colonial mindset, the benevolent European guiding the primitive local. There's no way around that.
But, and here's the contradiction that makes him so hard to categorize. He was simultaneously a ferocious critic of colonialism itself.
He was a blistering critic. If you read his sermons from as early as 1905, before he even went to Africa, he wasn't pulling any punches. He absolutely blasted civilized men.
What did he say?
He talked about how Europeans robbed indigenous people of their land, ruined them with alcohol and disease, and unleashed the scum of mankind upon them in the colonies. It's incredibly strong language.
I read in one of the sources where he called his medical work atonement.
Yes. He saw it that way. He believed the white race had a massive debt of guilt to pay back to Africa for the crimes committed.
Yeah.
So on one hand, you have this man who is dedicating his life to making amends for the sins of colonialism.
Right.
On the other hand, he still holds this patronizing junior brother attitude toward the very people he's serving.
It's such a paradox. It's a reminder that even historical saints are products of their time. You can be a revolutionary humanitarian and still have major, major blind spots.
Absolutely. And despite those blind spots, the world recognized the sheer force of his example, the sheer moral weight of his life's work. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952.
And in true Schweitzer fashion, he doesn't keep the money for himself.
No, of course not. He uses the entire $33,000 prize money to build a proper leprosarium, a dedicated village for patients with leprosy at Lambaréné.
But he didn't just retire into the jungle after the Nobel. He wasn't done. In his later years, he takes on a completely new cause.
The final act. The man who started as a theologian and musician becomes a global activist against nuclear weapons.
It makes perfect sense if you think about reverence for life. Nuclear war is the ultimate, absolute violation of that principle.
Precisely. The ultimate disrespect for life. He worked with Albert Einstein, Otto Hahn, the chemist who discovered nuclear fission, and Bertrand Russell. In 1957, he broadcast the Declaration of Conscience from Radio Oslo.
What was the message?
He argued that nuclear tests and the resulting radiation were a crime against life itself, not just human life, but the environment, the animals, the plants, the future genetic code of the planet.
He was talking about environmentalism and genetic damage way before it was a mainstream concern.
Way ahead of his time on that. And he kept working until the very end. He died in 1965 at the age of 90, right there in Lambaréné.
At his hospital.
At his hospital. He was buried on the banks of the Ogooué River, the same river where he had his great philosophical insight, and the marker on his grave. It's a simple wooden cross that he made himself.
From the grand concert halls of Paris to a simple grave by a river in Gabon. It's an unbelievable journey.
It is. And when we try to sum up what it all means, there is a concept in medical education today called the Schweitzer effect.
The Schweitzer effect? What is that?
It comes from something he said. Example is not the main thing in influencing others. It is the only thing.
It is the only thing.
Yeah.
Wow, that hits hard.
It suggests that all the books, all the sermons, all the concerts, all the brilliant ideas, none of it matters as much as the life you actually live. Schweitzer once said his hospital was just an improvisation on his philosophy.
An improvisation.
The hospital was the physical manifestation of his beliefs. It was messy, it was imperfect, but it was real, it was action.
That is a powerful place to land. It makes you think about our own lives. We live in this world that, as we said, tells you to specialize, to optimize, to talk a big game on social media. And here's a guy who said, no, I'm going to do music, I'm going to do God, I'm going to do science, and I'm going to do service, and I'm going to tie them all together into one messy, beautiful, contradictory life of action.
And even if the results were imperfect, even if we look back and rightly critique his paternalism or his hospital standards, the sheer gravity of that action is undeniable. He challenged the fragmentation of the modern world by showing that a life of thought must eventually lead to a life of action.
So I guess here's the question for you listening right now. In a world that tells you to pick a lane, what would it look like to bridge those divides in your own life? What does it look like to turn your philosophy, whatever it is, into an improvisation of service?
Everyone can have their own Lambaréné. It might not be in a jungle in Africa. It might be right down the street. You just have to find it.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.